On April 1st, 2023, trans content creator Dylan Mulvaney posted an Instagram reel in which she celebrated March Madness with a six-pack of Bud Light beer with her face on it. This paid campaign was intended to bring a new kind of audience to the slowly dwindling beer brand, but it really couldn't have gone any worse than it did. Within days of the campaign's launch, Kid Rock posts this video of him shooting a pile of Bud Light with an automatic rifle, and it sparks one of the most impactful boycotts of all time. All over social media, people are destroying or pouring out their Bud Light beers, and within 3 months, Bud Light sales were at least 20% lower than normal and are still below pre-ad levels to this day. Now, a few years have gone by. We have the numbers, and it's pretty striking. Bud Light lost around $1.4 billion in sales in the US, and the company lost over $27 billion in value, and their US market share has been slashed in half. And perhaps most pivotally, they dropped from the most popular beer brand in the US to 3rd place. It's been over 2 years since all of this went down, and as recently as February of this year, the company is still trying to rebound from this boycott. But as people start to slowly forget about this controversy, we thought it was about time to see what this story can teach us about boycotts in general, but also about what really happened to Bud Light. Now, if you're thinking that maybe it's a bit quick to be making a video about a boycott that only happened 2.5 years ago, it's worth mentioning that most boycotts only last a few months at most and generally don't have a huge impact on the broader economics of the companies in question. That's why this video is actually just the first in what we're creating as a series about boycotts and how they're working and not working to shape and change our modern consumer world. The reason why we started with this one, though, is because it's pretty crazy. So let's set the scene for a second, because I think it is hilarious that this was not a whole production line of beers. There weren't millions of beer cans all across the US with Dylan's face on it. It was a single six-pack sent from the brand to the creator for a single promotional video on her page. But whatever the scale or intention of the ad, it created an ideological chasm between the people who typically drink Bud Light beer and the new brand that Bud Light was trying to cultivate. But of course, the glaring issue here is that there was a trans person on a beer can. You can't detangle the fact that a lot of this movement's politically charged nature was in reaction to the trans rights controversies that exist in the US and the world at large. This explains some of the hateful and violent reactions that we saw online. Because if you've even been paying a little bit of attention to Bud Light over the years, they've been openly supportive of LGBTQ+ issues all the way back to the 90s, and they have never received backlash like this before. So the trans of it all is definitely a huge component of why this was so divisive, but there are a few other aspects that came together here. This campaign with Dylan Mulvaney was all spearheaded by the then recently appointed VP of Marketing, Alyssa Heinerschild, I think. Heinerschild? She was brought on to inject some new life into the Bud Light brand, right? To develop the brand's relationship with younger people because, as she said herself on a podcast, the brand had a sort of frat-like culture surrounding it. But what I find fascinating about that statement is that Bud Light is definitely not the most Republican or right-leaning beer brand in America. There's a great article that we found in the researching of this video from the Harvard Business Review, which we're going to be referencing a lot, and it will be linked down in our description along with all of our other sources. And they have this great graph here that shows that Bud Light is actually one of the more centrist beer brands within the spectrum. And this is actually perhaps part of the reason why this went as badly as it did. See, Bud Light isn't like the leftist, known for being outspoken at rallies kind of ally, like Ben & Jerry's or Patagonia or the Lush of the world. They're a Pride Week with a rainbow on their logo kind of ally. They have been extremely successful for a very long time at just doing whatever is barely necessary to maintain the status quo. They appeal to a lot of people across the political spectrum, but this misstep totally changed that. Now, perhaps they were trying something and it just didn't work, right? Because this misstep could have been the beginning of a whole new brand image, a starting point for a new journey for the Bud Light empire to become a, queer icon, But that's not what happened, and it became very clear very shortly after that Bud Light was gonna backpedal hard. Bud Light distanced themselves immediately from Dylan and apparently didn't even kind of communicate with her. The advertisement itself was removed from the internet, and the CEO released this weird public message that kind of half apologized for the whole thing. And that just made it so much worse, which we're gonna talk about later in the video. Because see, like with most boycotts, the initial burst of emotions are big and they're really well documented across news networks across the country. But then, you know, a guy with a lot of orange makeup on makes another executive order that pisses everyone off, or an unprecedented event happens and things are forgotten. And in some ways, that's actually still the story here with Anheuser-Busch, who is the parent company that owns Bud Light. See, these angry boycotters destroyed their Bud Lights just to go out and buy Budweiser instead, which is owned by the same company. So it is kind of funny when articles are talking about how Bud Light has fallen to the #3 most popular beer in America, when one of the beers that superseded them was a beer brand owned by the same company. But even with a nearly complete stranglehold on the light beer market in the US, these boycotts against Bud Light did end up costing Anheuser-Busch in the long run. Their shares dropped 17.3% in 2023 and continued to slip in 2024, most of which has been attributed to the boycott. Now, things are starting to get better for Bud Light for a variety of reasons, but they are still showing a decline in sales. And so here is a quick breakdown of a few of the reasons why that's happened. 1, polarization. As we mentioned earlier, being polarized isn't a bad thing in this economy. Actually, some brands use that as a strategy to sell themselves to particular groups. But for a centrist beer brand like Bud Light, this was particularly damaging, because you had both sides of the political spectrum mad at you for different reasons, which we're going to talk about later. 2, substitutability. Bud Light is just one of the 300 light beer brands in the US right now. And if you've tried any light beer, they're pretty much all exactly the same. So switching from Bud Light to something else was not hard. 3, changes in distribution. When you are a beer brand that sells over 269 million cases of beer a year and suddenly your stock is sitting on shelves, stores start to shift their products around. This then creates a feedback loop of continually dwindling sales that they are still fighting today because stores just aren't stocking their product. 4, brand ownership. This felt like a betrayal to the long-standing Bud Light drinkers. Over 60% of the people who stopped drinking the beer said it was because of the brand's perceived shift in values. And because Bud Light was not an ideologically driven company, there was nobody on the other side of the aisle willing to do a counter boycott in response. The Bud Light story is a particularly loud example of what could be called the anti-woke movement. It seems like until somewhat recently, companies boasted their environmental and social achievements in these lavish year-end reports and proudly changed their colors to whatever social causes were being celebrated that day or week. This tokenistic way of seeming to appeal to everyone is of course not ideal, but it is an easy way for brands to play both sides. Companies from across the spectrum could use a little bit of clever marketing and some data visualizations to show that they do in fact care about the people in the world around them, even if they really don't give a shit. But it seems like that might be getting harder for people to swallow. Regardless of what side of the issue you stand on, I think we can all agree that when a big brand poses as a member of your community, it's always cringe. Like it never works basically. And it is almost always in these moments when a brand tries too hard to identify with a certain group of people that they make their biggest missteps. Do you remember the Pepsi protest advertisements with Kylie Jenner? Because that was so fucking bad, dude. This was around the time that there was a lot of outrage and public unrest in the wake of police brutality, and there was the rise of Black Lives Matter. And they released this ad trying to sell Pepsi and this rich lady as the solution. And it flopped. Like it was horribly received, understandably, by the left and by members of the Black Lives Matter community. And that's because Pepsi isn't really associated with that world. They just tried to make money off of it. And so in the same way, Bud Light is not a queer company. This partnership was not only not on brand for them, it just didn't feel right. And that suspicion was then proven to be correct when it came out later that Bud Light never reached out to Dylan Mulvaney after the controversy. This enraged the left-leaning population, and they had already alienated the right-leaning population, and so they somehow became universally hated over one ad. It's honestly kind of impressive. But things have changed. We have moved on in some ways, and Bud Light is hoping that they can move on too. So what has this beer behemoth done to restore their connection with fellow beer drinkers? Well, in the last couple of years, they have released a variety of advertisements that have been just very boring and normal to try and ignore that anything has ever really happened. But for the 2025 Super Bowl, they actually started taking a side again.
Fucking Shane Gillis is heartbroken. He drinks Bud Light every time he does Protect Our Parks. Those things have fucking millions of views.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, they won't give him a Bud Light.
They should give him some lips.
If they were smart, they would send Shane a Bud Light with his face on it too.
They released the Big Men on the Cul-de-Sac ad with Post Malone and the comedian guy who hangs out with Joe Rogan a lot. It's not funny or cool really, but it is very importantly manly. I can't recommend that you watch it because it's not worth your time, honestly. And if you watch the Super Bowl, you probably saw it a lot because they probably spent a boatload of money making that thing. It's got a couple of big names in it. It's within their old stomping grounds, and it's sponsoring the most American sport of all time. They have since released a bunch of different ads with Post Malone and fucking whatever is the guy. They've since released a bunch of different advertisements with these two specifically. I think in an attempt to build back some of that rapport with which I can only consider to be some of the most popular men in their typical demographics. But even then, people aren't letting it go, with a lot of the comments underneath these videos reminding Bud Light that they are still in the right-wing doghouse. Now, we really don't know where Bud Light is going to end up in the future. They might recover fully, we don't know. But they are not the only companies getting caught up in these kinds of controversies. We're currently researching 2 other scripts about boycotts, and they are both similar and completely different in a bunch of ways, and they're super interesting. So I suggest that you subscribe if you want to see those. And if you want to support our content and what we do here and get access to the D-Brand podcast, which is our Patreon exclusive podcast, you can find that over on Patreon. Your beloved local craft brewery is now probably up for sale in some capacity, and the only people that are going to buy it is usually private equity. Like, my favorite local brewery has been bought out. Phillips is now partially owned by a private equity company that invests in some other brands as well.
I have to give you some bad news, Levi. I follow them on Instagram, and they have recently started releasing sandwiches. So,
oh no.
I think it's all going downhill. They moved on to hoagies. Beer is no longer top priority.
I hate it when creators promote low effort content on Patreon. My effort with this podcast specifically was to create something that I enjoyed making that was genuinely interesting and valuable to the people who watch it. Every couple of weeks or so, we break down some headlines going on in the world of consumerism and talk about some stuff that's going on behind the scenes here on the channel. It gives you an opportunity to connect directly with us, so we take questions if people have them, and you get to see a bit of the behind the scenes on how we work out the answers that we provide you in these videos and how we produce them. But regardless, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week.